We all come to some extent to the service with a heavy heart. The week has been hard. There have been one tragedy, it seems, after another. And I'm reminded of a Bible verse that my grandmother taught me when I was probably about 3 years old. And it said, I was glad when they said unto me, let us go into the house of the Lord. Here is for today a place of refuge, a place of holding and caring, and a place from which we can be sent renewed. We're going to be talking about widening the welcome and embracing our call to racial justice. We read the verse, Matthew 13:31-32, and it reads again as thus. He told them another parable. The kingdom of heaven is like a mustard seed, which a man took and planted in his field. Though it is the smallest of all seeds, yet it grows. It is the largest of garden plants and becomes a tree, so that the birds come and perch in its branches. I'd like to talk a little bit this morning about sown seeds. Every morning for the past few weeks, I rise to the sound of birds, mostly robins, perched on a branch outside my window singing. The sound is familiar and comforting. It seems that no matter where I live, robins always return, and they find a sturdy branch. Sometimes I imagine myself as that bird on that sturdy branch, and I wonder, what would I say? I suspect I would sing of joy and hope and of anticipation and of strife and sadness and triumph. Then I might just think of the sturdy branch, seed sown. I stand on the shoulders of great people, generation after generation after generation. There are things I may never know about terrible things that happened, things of this past week, about mysteries of the universe, and many, many more. So I must keep an inquisitive and open mind and heart and stand on the things I know. I know my hope, my faith, and my understanding. And I know that I stand on the shoulders of sturdy people who have gone before me, of my ancestors who chose to live through the wretchedness of the Middle Passage when dying might have been easier, the enslaved on the Savage and Albritton plantations in North Carolina and Alabama who endured the whip, separation from family, and engaged in some rebellion, but they stayed. I stand on the shoulders of white allies who secreted water to the thirsty and dying, soon to be enslaved on those horrible ships. Those who risked all teaching people to read and write, people like W.E.B. Du Bois, of native peoples who sheltered my people when they escaped tyranny. I stand on the shoulders of ordinary people whose stories may never be known outside their families and their small communities. My family walked across the Pettus Bridge from Selma to Montgomery during the Civil Rights March. You don't see them in the pictures because usually the pictures are those people in the front, of King and all of those very, very key and important people. But if you could pan back toward the middle and the end, you can look at me because most of the savages look alike, You can look at me and you can see a savage, and you can see a savage. They had been in that generation, in Montgomery and in Snow Hill and in Camden for generations. I can trace them back to the 1780s in those counties. They had to be there because they knew they owed a debt to those who had paved the way for them. They had to stand up, and they had to show up. In my family, we were taught from an early age, by what my family called precept and example, that we had to both show up and stand up. Some of you who have been in my workshops know that I was raised on the west side of the state in a rural town on Lake Michigan. I was almost always the only black girl in class. Sometimes I can remember one other, but at most there were two of us. You know, it wasn't unusual, especially in elementary school, for boys to pull my braids, call me the N-word, and run. Often I would just beat them up. But if my mother found out, and she almost always found out because my brother was a tattletale, she would be upset with me and disappointed. And she would explain that violence was not the answer. And this was long before the nonviolence movement of the 60s and 70s. And certainly before the WWJ bracelets. You know, we lived far out in the country, about 2 miles from town. We had no car, we had no phone. But when these incidents would happen, my mother would walk the 2 miles to town the next day and talk to the principal and talk to the teacher and explain to them what her expectations were and what her timeline for meeting those expectations were. And then in the evening, we would walk to the person who had pulled my pigtail and offended me. My mother's name was Johnetta. Me and Johnetta walking down the road. And when we get there, she would explain to them what had happened, and again, what her expectations were and what her timeline was. When we would be walking home, she would tell me about what she expected, what I should do, what alternative behaviors God expected of me. I was filled with pride when we walked down that country road. On the way home, she would explain to me about why these things were happening and what racial injustice was about. Sometimes we drift into silence, walking along, and I could enjoy in my mind then the experience of Jimmy and Johnny and whoever getting in trouble and being held accountable and having to face Johnetta. Then in the first week of my 3rd grade year, my teacher told what I understand as an adult a very racist story about her summer vacation in New Orleans. I never spoke again in that class unless I was asked a direct question. My mother was called. I never spoke again through the whole school year unless asked a direct question. My mother was called to the school because of my odd behavior. My behavior was odd. At first, as long as I was not being disrespectful to the teacher and I was doing my schoolwork and I was answering questions that she asked me, my mother didn't worry about it. But as the months dragged on and she saw a happy child during Christmas break who didn't resemble that sullen, I don't want to go to school today child earlier before break. And so she began to question me about what was wrong. And I really didn't know. And so she walked me back to the time when she sort of thought this behavior started And I don't know how I told the story or why I told the story, because I hadn't really connected the two. But when I told her the story, she knew exactly what had silenced me. When the weather broke and she was finally able to walk back to town, she was in the road again. And she got to the school, and the two of us waited in the waiting room of the principal's office for what seemed like a very long time. Just sitting there. And then she turned to me and she said, "Monique, you remember the Sunday school lesson?" And I got a little worried because I know there was going to be a quiz. She continued. She said, "You know the lesson where Jesus talked about if you have faith of a mustard seed, you could move a mountain?" I only remembered the lesson because the school teacher had brought a package of mustard seed so that we could see how tiny it was. And one of the guys in the class had turned it upside down on the floor, caused a big kerfuffle, and gotten kicked out of the Sunday school class. So I remembered that lesson. So I nodded to her and said, "Yes, ma'am." She handed me a little tiny bead and said quite firmly to me, "We're going to move this mountain. God is on our side." I felt comforted. I felt less anxious. I was anxious because we weren't just going into the principal's office to get Jimmy, John, and Paul, any of them in trouble. This was a teacher. And elementary school students tend to love their teachers. And so I didn't particularly want her to get in trouble. So my mother told the story of what I experienced in my class. The principal called in a few girls from my class, friends of mine, who had no memory of the details of the story. And who would? What third grader would remember a story that their teacher told at the beginning of the school year about their boring vacation? But I remembered. So she dismissed it with saying something like, "You and your daughter are just a little bit too sensitive about race." You know, for a second, I saw this flash go across my mother's face, and I understood why sometimes I beat up the boys in the parking lot. And then she got back her composure, and she took me by the hand. And we left. Nothing was said, I understand, to the teacher. My mother's face said it all, that determination. My mother brought the matter up in our small church congregation. And in addition, the pastor then took it to the local ministerial association. And at the next school board meeting, I understand from the retelling of the story later in my life, that the room was crowded with members of my church, pastors from other churches around the county, and their congregants. I never knew what happened to the teacher. We moved. I didn't return to the school. I regained my academic and social voice in the 4th grade. There was never a large movement then. This was in the 50s. There was never a large movement. Every now and then when some injustice happened, people would come back together. But there was nothing big that went on, except for people who believed in justice, heard about injustice, stood up, and showed up. I've learned some valuable life lessons from this experience. One, that I must speak to the mountain for it to be moved. Speaking truth to power sometimes takes a village, and sometimes takes one courageous and determined person. I also learned that owning your own voice is critical to your soul and your life development. And when we find someone who has been silenced, we must speak for them. We stand on the shoulders of extraordinary people and ordinary people who have showed up, helped shoulder burdens for those who couldn't, allies who believed in justice. And they were there. In the parable that Jesus told about sowing seed in various different types of ground, he said, still other seeds fell on good soil where it produced a crop 160, 30 times what was sown. It is incumbent to us to sow seeds so that someone will be standing on our shoulders, so that someone will be perched in a branch in a sturdy tree. I encourage us to plant seeds of justice and of peace and of hope and understanding until, as Martin Luther King said when he quoted from the prophet Amos, until justice rolls down like water and righteousness like a mighty river. Blessed be the word of the Lord.